This is the Nobel Podcast, where we talk about how to optimize your technology, life, and mind. We're joined by special operations veterans, entrepreneurs, investors, and others who have overcome difficulty to make it to the top of their craft by staying in the fight.
All right. Welcome to the Nobel Podcast. I'm Rob Huberty. I have Sam Alaimo, and today we're honored to have Bill Boyle with us. So the background, Bill is a mentor to us. He has an unbelievable career that I've only read about, and I'm excited to talk about today, from going from Army infantry officer during Vietnam, the Phoenix program, the Tet Offensive, all of the crazy Vietnam stories that I read about as a kid, and then transitioning to a business career. And he's a mentor to us now. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I'm really excited to get into the stories about Vietnam that were inspiration for me when I was a kid and read books about the Phoenix program. And I didn't really know what it is. So getting firsthand stories today. But let's go to where it all started. Where did you grow up? What was life like growing up?
I grew up in a small town in Western New York. The place was called Lockport, New York. It's about 15 to 18 miles from Buffalo and Niagara Falls. It's on the Erie Canal, and it had about 20 to 22,000 people when I was growing up, which would have been in the 50s. And some demographics guy wrote about our generation as the most boring in the world. So I was born in 1942, and, the baby boomers started in 46. So sort of in between, and we were considered to be part of the Eisenhower generation because of World War II. And, he was the president when I was growing up. But anyway, the town had a Catholic high school and a public high school. And for grade schools, there were Catholics in one place, Italians in another place, Polish in another place. And we all sort of came together in high school. I mean, life was good. My dad had an 8th grade education and had a shoe store, and my mother was a nurse, head of the maternity ward at the hospital in town. And when we got to high school, that's where it really started showing up, because I had the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales, and they believed in corporal punishment. And I've since found out that 3 of them who were actually mentors to me were in the Pacific in World War II. And one of them didn't know this at the time, but one had the Distinguished Service Cross, and 2 of them had Silver Stars. In fact, I think one of them had 2 Silver Stars.
Oh, wow.
The football coach was this fellow named Les Dugan, a real Irishman. And Les had been a Marine in the Pacific. And these guys never really talked about, the war or anything like that. But when we'd go to Boy Scouts, our dads and these people would be sitting around the campfire, and we could hear them at night. And they were usually talking about stuff, and they weren't laughing very much. The principal of the school was a guy named Father Godley, believe it or not. And he was a former Marine, I'm almost sure. He was about 5'7" tall, and he was the Pacific Fleet's boxing champion in his weight class. And so when people would get out of line, he'd just as soon go into the ring with them. And there was one particular case where one of the big lineman football players got sort of crosswise with the teachers somehow and got into a fight. Father Godley says, Friday morning at assembly in the ring. And so this guy's going to beat the hell out of Father Godley. And Father Kenny, who was another one of my mentors, interesting guy, he was Father Godley's second. So here we are at assembly, the ring is set up, the football player gets in, and one of the priests is his second, and he's ready to kill this guy. And here comes Father Godley running in. And if the Rocky music would have been available at the time, they would have been playing it. And so Father Godley hops into the ring. He's walking down, and he's got his boxing paraphernalia on. United States Marine Corps. He's got the big championship belt. And Father Kenny is behind him as his second. So Godley gets in the ring. It's supposed to be 3 rounds. And he's right-handed, so he says, I'll tie my right hand behind my back. And the football player for that time was large, maybe 6'1", and Father Godley's like 5'7". And so the first round is nothing but the football player trying to kill him and Godley missing. The second round happens, Father Godley comes out, knocks him right out with his left hand. It's all over with. So that was sort of my high school experience. I mean, we had a great football team. We won a championship, I think, in Western New York. It was just, a fantastic time growing up.
So it sounds like your mentors were World War II vets, and you threw something in Boy Scouts. How far into the Boy Scouts did you make it? Did you do that the whole way? Were you an Eagle Scout?
To my father's great dissatisfaction, no. I was not a very good swimmer, and I know you guys are swimmers. I couldn't pass the life-saving merit badge. So I got to one below the Eagle Scout.
So you grew up with this, distinctly America of a bygone era, I suppose. The something that we have in our heads of, small town America, people who fought in the wars, people who were part of the community, and then you ended up going into the Vietnam era. So as you were leading to this, were you a kid who got in trouble all the time? Was Catholic guilt on you and you followed the rules, or did you take a couple of beatings from some of these priests and nuns?
All three of those things. So I guess we got in trouble, but we didn't get thrown in jail. In New York, you could drink when you were 18 at that time, anything. So we were all drinking when we were 16. And if you got in trouble, the police would sort of drive you home, or they would follow you home and turn their lights off while you pulled into the driveway. If you got in trouble in school, you had two choices. One is they would tell your parents, the priest, and they would do that. They all belonged to the Knights of Columbus. So, they'd all be down on Friday night. And usually the punishment from your father was a lot worse, like taking the car away from you or not allowing you to use the one family car we had. Or you could get what was called the Board of Education, which was particularly from Father Kenny. And the Board of Education was the fraternity paddle. And it wasn't a tap at all. I dodged a bullet, so to speak, once. A good friend of mine, actually, his mother was a nurse too, and that's how we knew each other, because he was over at the public high school. We were fascinated with blowing things up. And so we had each gotten a chemistry set for Christmas. And of course, we're trying to make bombs. And the basic bomb, as you guys know, is charcoal, sulfur, and potassium nitrate. And of course, we're in chemistry class, and all this kind of stuff. So my friend says, potassium nitrate has 2 oxygen atoms. Potassium permanganate has 5. And I bet that gives you a lot more power. And we were setting out to make a pipe bomb. So we conned one of our mothers into getting us potassium permanganate, because at that time it was used for athlete's foot, to treat athlete's foot. I mean, we made up some story, it was nothing but a lie. So we get this jar of potassium permanganate. And so we go ahead about making our stuff up and making the slurry for the fuse. We even bought different parts of the pipe for the pipe bomb at 3 different hardware stores, I think. And we put this thing together and we take it out there was a World War II era airstrip outside of town, and we're going to blow this thing up. And there's a big boulder out there. So we put the pipe bomb over and we get behind it, we light it, get behind it, and the damn thing doesn't go off. And it's like 5 or 6 minutes past when it was supposed to go off. And just when we're thinking about, no, let's just leave it here, we'll go home, that thing went off. And it was huge, because the pipe bomb itself was a 6-inch piece of pipe. It was big. There were some trees behind us, and this is my first introduction to shrapnel. There were pieces of the pipe bomb sticking into the tree right above the rock. We got the hell out of there. You could hear the police sirens. And at dinner that night, my dad says to my mother, Mary, did you know there was some explosion out at Lee Airfield, was the name of the place? No, Frank, what was that all about? I don't know. But he had friends on the force, of course. They're looking into it. And so we never did own up to it, and we were never caught. But it did give me an appreciation for explosives. And I know it's politically incorrect today, but I really loved blowing things up. So when I got in the Army and got my hands on det cord and hand grenades, I was really happy.
Let's go bring that to the next step. You ended up, you said 42. So the Vietnam War is only in its infancy, probably when you're going to school. What was that pattern? So let's talk about college and then actually going into the military.
Yeah, so I always had a big interest in history and politics. So my undergraduate degree is in political science, and at 17, I went off to Michigan State University and joined up with every extracurricular activity I could. And I was a yearbook photographer, and that took up a lot of time. So my grades suffered. I got thrown out after the first year, and my parents got a letter, and I'm paraphrasing it, but it's almost literally true. At the end of the letter, it says, "We believe your son should take a year off to mature." And my dad said, "Well, Bill, I told you I'd pay for your school if you got good grades, you're on your own." And he only had an 8th grade education. He was smart, but he only had an 8th grade education. So I finished up at the University of Buffalo, and I had to go to night school for a year. And I had 2 jobs. One of them was in the shoe store. And I mean, it's a personal bias, but that's why when I hear kids today say that they can't do it, I mean, so many people in my generation worked when you went to college. But that aside, so I finally finished up at the University of Buffalo, and I knew I was going to get drafted. And my grades were okay. I mean, they were nothing to write about, but I did get my degree. And I knew I was going to get drafted, and it was a small town. So about 3 months before I graduated, I started making the rounds of the recruiters. And I was going to go in the Air Force because some of my friends were there. And I had very poor eyesight, so that didn't work out. And so I went over, I checked out the Marines, and of course they were interested. And a lot of my brothers on my mother's side, she came from a family of 13, were Marines. So there was a big attraction in the family for there. It was just, I mean, it was assumed you would go in. I mean, I never thought about it. And so I went to the Army, and this program had just come out. It was called the College Option Program. And the College Option Program allowed you to go to OCS and become an officer because you had a college degree, and you ticked that box off. So I signed up for that. So you had to go through a bunch of tests in front of a panel of officers. And I passed all of that. And I remember going in front of this panel. There's like a colonel, and there were 5 of them all together. And because everything was done alphabetically, I ended up being the first one in. Because it took me 5 years to get out of college, some of my friends were already in Vietnam. And the colonel said, "Well, congratulations, what branch do you want to go into?" And so, as I think you guys know, in the Army at least, there's combat arms, combat support, and support. So I said, transportation support. He said, "Well, that's all filled up." And so a friend of mine was already in Vietnam, and he was in the Signal Corps, which is combat support, the engineers, Signal Corps. So I said, Signal Corps. And I can remember this like it's today. He said, "Son, we need infantry officers. If you want to go to OCS, you have to go to Fort Benning." So that's how I ended up going to Fort Benning. And the deal was you had to make it through basic training, which, was a big difference coming out of civilian life. So that was 2 months. And then you had to make it through advanced infantry training, which was 2 months. So I did basic at Fort Gordon, Georgia, advanced infantry at Fort Jackson, and then 6 months of infantry OCS at Fort Benning. And it turned out that the group I was in was the first group that had 85% college graduates and 15% NCO. It usually was the other way around. We lost, even in the advanced infantry training, a number of people just were deselected. I mean, for various reasons. And then there were some, of course, who said, I don't want to do this. But one of the most interesting things was here I came from a small town in Western New York and going through, and, I mean, we weren't poor, but we weren't wealthy. But in basic training, my bunkmate was this kid from a farm in Georgia who didn't have any teeth and who hadn't been 50 miles away from home. And then there were a bunch of blacks from the inner city of Detroit and Philadelphia. And we were all just thrown together. And then there were some guys, the college guys, there were some who came from fairly affluent families. We never had any trouble. I mean, they taught us, I had grown up shooting and all that, so I was already a good marksman. But we taught them how to study and get through tests and all that kind of stuff. They taught us, how to survive outside. And it was really interesting.
What do you attribute the fact that there was no trouble on that for? Like what made that better for you?
Well, it's sort of typical, I think, of what you find in the military. They sort of promote friction in the beginning, and the idea is to get everybody down to a lowest common denominator. So there were some fights in the first week, and then it became us versus them. And that's what I attribute it to, which is exactly what they were looking for. It really happened in OCS, big time, the us versus them thing. But anyway, got through AIT and then reported into infantry OCS.
You were going to get drafted, so you leaned into it and enlisted. And then you tried to choose a more support role instead of the combat ground role. But knowing what came later in your career, you went into some of the most combat-intensive frontline forces imaginable. So did you fall in love with the combat arms and the front line?
I volunteered for it all. There are a couple of things that didn't work out, which we can get to, but that's correct. Sam, there's only one thing I would say. I think everybody has their own individual experiences in combat. I'm not sure. There are people who did a lot more than I did, for sure. So I don't want to make it sound like, my experience was necessarily any worse or any better. There was a thing about it that I fell in love with. And it was the camaraderie, I guess, that I think I've spoken to you guys about it before. I've never, ever, ever seen it in my business career, ever. I went to work after I got my MBA for a very intense organization, and they'd all be jumping through their, whatever, on things that just didn't seem important. And one of our favorite sayings was, well, hell, nobody's shooting at us. How much worse can this get? So
how'd you go from an infantry officer to Intel to literally the Phoenix program? Like, where did that transition start?
First of all, I never thought I was going to make it out of OCS. I know it's probably not like your training, but like for the first 24, 36 hours, we had to belly crawl every place. It was physical. They whacked us in E&E, we were waterboarded. It was very physical thing. And we started off, Rob, with, I think, about 256 or 257. We graduated at 146. And I made it out, and I didn't know this at the time until graduation, but I made it out as a distinguished candidate in the top 10%. Because I always thought I was going to get paneled out. Not always, but a lot of times. And so a lot of people quit. A lot of people got paneled out. And so I had my choice of assignments. And of course, I think we all volunteered for Airborne and Ranger. But unfortunately, in a way, I had always been fascinated by intelligence. Grew up with the books, the movies, did a lot of things throughout my life. Once I sent a code to the FBI and asked them to break it. They actually sent something back and said, and it was broken, and they said, call us after you get out of college or something like that. But I also volunteered for intelligence, specifically counterintelligence, because that was big back then. You had the Philby case and all the infiltrations and all that from World War II. And so I expected I was going to come out of OCS and go right to airborne school. Instead, I came out of OCS and went to Fort Holabird, which is outside of Baltimore, which is where the Army's intelligence school was located. And I took the basic intelligence officers course there, and then I took the counterintelligence curriculum. And my father-in-law, I ended up getting divorced, and my father-in-law, and he's also passed away. He had been a P-51 pilot in World War II. I believe he was an ace. And he came back in Korea, and he was making a career out of it. He was stationed over at Chanute Air Force Base, so we got married over there. When I got my orders to Vietnam, he took me aside and he said, "What do you know about putting in an airstrike, to support you on the ground?" And so I told him, and he said, yeah. He said, "Let me tell you what it's like from a pilot's perspective." And remember, this is all no smart bombs or anything. I forget what he was flying at the time. He did move to jets and then to helicopters. Highly decorated, but a crazy, crazy man. Worse than the great Santini by about 5,000%. Very abusive to his kids and all that. But he did. I ended up using this stuff. Also, my mother, being a nurse before I went to Vietnam, she said, "Now, Billy," she said, "you need to know two things." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "You need to know how to stitch." And she got out a suture kit and some oranges and is teaching me how to sew things up. And she said, "You need to know how to deliver a baby." So ended up in Vietnam. I delivered one and assisted in another one. But anyway, I got my orders to Vietnam, and I was supposed to show up in an intelligence unit in Saigon. They said, "Don't bring your uniform," and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so okay. So I get there, and of course, typical of the Army, they say, "Well, that's all filled up." And I'd heard that before. So they took 12 of us and said, "You're going to be advisors with MACV." And there were 2 majors, the rest were captains, and I think 2 of us were first lieutenants.
Let me ask this. MACV to me has a profound meaning. I don't know if that's necessarily the birth of, special operations, but World War II special operations meant something different. At that point, the SEAL teams came out, in that generation, right? Like in the 62 at the end. So it was born at that time. Did you know what that meant? Was that very significant to you, or is it just something that you were told, I guess I'm MACV?
But MACV, that was the original advisory group that was sent over there. And special ops in World War II, a lot of that were the Rangers and the OSS. So I knew about it. I mean, I was a student of that history. And, for example, some of my favorite books were, I have it here on my shelf now, is Rommel's Infantry Attacks, or Thucydides' The Peloponnesian War. So I knew about it, and there were 2 groups in Vietnam. One was MACV and one was USARV. USARV was United States Army, Vietnam, and MACV, had everything else. So MACV had the advisors. And of course, under MACV was also the group called Studies and Observation Group, SOG. And that's where all you guys, guys like you were. And I actually have a couple friends that were in SOG. The first 2 weeks in Vietnam with some of the people of this group of 12, it's really interesting because I got to learn a lot about what was going on in Vietnam. The interesting thing about that is that you're with the Vietnamese. I even had a discussion with General McChrystal once about advisors in Vietnam and advisors in Afghanistan and Iraq, and actually living with the people. And particularly down in the Delta where I was, there were no American troop units. The U.S. 9th Division was on the southern part of Saigon, which was one of the major invasion routes. So it was a totally different experience than what I was sent over for, what I expected, what I was prepared for. I didn't speak the language. Again, the military's come a long way, but back then, you got out in the top 10% of your OCS class, you're a counterintelligence officer. That means that you can be the S2 on an advisory team. And that's how I got to the advisory team.
Were you crazily overwhelmed by this? Did you roll with the punches? What was that experience like?
Well, I wasn't overwhelmed at all with it. Would they say the average age of people in Vietnam was like 19? I was 24 or 25, and I didn't know any better to be overwhelmed by it. The thing that scared me the most is as I made my way down into the Delta, like to Kanto, Sadek, and then down to Vinh Binh where I was stationed, was I kept hearing about my commanding officer who had the Medal of Honor from Korea and was a VMI graduate, which is the connection to our buddies. Our friend Dan. And I heard that he was just a terror and that he chewed people up. Colonel Showalter was probably the biggest influence on my life ever. And when I landed at the airstrip and the sergeant major came and picked me up and took me to see Colonel Showalter, I was actually shaken. Because all of a sudden, and maybe back to your other question, I started realizing where I was, and there was no big army here. And, they were issuing us at the time M2 carbines. And thankfully, before Ted, I got my M16.
Can you get into, I guess, the first time you were outside the wire? What did it feel like? What was the vibe like? What were the smells? What was your adrenaline? Can you describe that first time?
Well, the first time I actually went on an operation, I went along with the guy I was replacing, who was a captain, and he didn't help me out at all. And the organization mirrored the military and civilian structure. So my counterpart was a guy named Dai Wi Han. He had fought with the Viet Minh during World War II, the communists, because they hated the Japanese. And so the S2 had a recon platoon that was headed up by a lieutenant named Lieutenant Fook. And he and I got to be very close together. So we're out on this operation. There's a guy, the captain I replaced, myself, a medic, and a radio operator. Those were the only 4 U.S., and then the Vietnamese. So we're out on this operation, and man, I don't know what the hell's going on. The heat and the humidity were killing me. And the rice paddies were full of water. And here these guys are lollygagging going down a paddy dike. And, no interval, none of the stuff you're taught. And all of a sudden I hear some gunshots. And it's going bang, 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 bang. And I take this swan dive right into the paddy. And of course, they fertilize it with human excrement and animal stuff and all this. And I'm down there and I am just suffocating. And it was deeper than I thought. And I told you I wasn't a good swimmer to start with. And I'm down there, and I finally stood up, and I must have been like a whale coming up. And these guys are all standing along the paddy dike, laughing their asses off at me. And they're laughing at me because I had forgotten the basics. It wasn't, bullets cracking over your head at supersonic speed. It was bang, 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 And so that was my introduction. And how did it smell, Sam? It smelled pretty bad.
What does that mean? Knowing the basics, the crack versus bang, bang, bang. What's the difference?
So the cracking are bullets going over your head supersonically. And the bang, bang, bang is just the gunshot, the sound it's making coming out of the gun. And so unless you hear that crack, 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 they don't have you sort of zeroed in. And even more so, the communist bloc back then used green tracers and we used red. And so, another basic you learn is where do the tracers burn out? So you can always figure out how close in contact you are by looking at where the tracers are burning out. If they're burning out way the hell down that way, you're pretty close. If they're burning out close by, so you start putting that stuff together.
So when you're new, bangs are scary, but once you get used to it, only cracks are scary. Maybe they're trying to get you to respond, and you're not going to respond to bangs if you don't hear cracks or see green.
And what they were trying to do is find out where your automatic weapons were. And so they wanted you to commit and they would carry around, the 60 millimeter mortars without a base plate, of course. And they were really good with those.
So what does that mean if you don't have a base plate?
First of all, you're carrying a lot less weight. And secondly, There's no aiming mechanism. And basically you're jamming it into the ground and figuring out this. And they were good. They on the second round, they were on. And the thing that scared me the most all the time were, of course, the booby traps, which were every place, but mortars. I hated mortars.
So if you're going out on these missions and you were not with big army units and you were going out as an advisor, what does a typical mission look like? Could you talk about a handful of missions?
On the advisory team, we could go for days without any contact in the province, or there'd be province out in one of the districts. But a typical mission would be, we would be in support of larger Vietnamese units who had American advisors with them. So all the advisors in the province all reported up to the province senior advisor, Colonel Showalter, and then when he left, he was replaced by Colonel Gerdner. And all the Vietnamese reported up to the military governor of the province, who at that time was a Vietnamese lieutenant colonel named Key. So we would typically be in support. It would be up at 4:30, go out and meet the recon platoon, get transported to wherever you were going. If it was a really large operation, we would have helicopter support. Most of the time, we got to the launch either by trucks or sampan along the canals. And then you'd go and, you'd follow the ops plan. Typically, something would happen that's not in the ops plan. The other part of it was that being the S2, I worked very closely with and they became friends with the COS, the chief of station in the province. And then he had two people working for him. One was a guy named Ken Ferguson, who received during TET the Distinguished Service Cross, and then later on at Da Nang received the Intelligence Star. And then the other person was Howard Paulson, a Navy SEAL, whom I just, as you know, hooked up with after 56 years a few days ago. So the operations that we would do with my recon platoon and the PRU would be part of the Phoenix effort, which was to eliminate the VC infrastructure, both the political and the military. And actually, the political is much more valuable to us than the military. That's how I got involved in Phoenix.
Can you elaborate on that specific point? So one of the major criticisms of Vietnam was focusing on body count, and that led to inflated numbers and a bunch of things that people ended up regretting. But you're talking about the political is more powerful. How do you quantify the impact of a political mission? What does that look like?
Couple things there, Sam, and you just really nailed it. When I met Colonel Showalter, he told me there were three things that he would hold me accountable for. One was, don't ever inflate the statistics or I'll court-martial you. He said, that's the game. This is really literally what he said. He said, that's the game here and I don't play it. The second thing was, don't fool around with the women in the province. I've got enough problems with Colonel Key. And the third thing was, if you drink, keep it under control. He didn't go for any of that stuff on statistics. Now, we did catch a few military people that were fairly important, but the political people that are important were like the tax collectors. They were the ones that knew how much each hamlet paid to the government in taxes, how much they paid to the VC, what their rice production was, how much of the rice went to the government, how much they gave to the VC, who owned the land. So as an example, a week or so before TET, we were out on an ambush, and here comes this guy running along a paddy dike. And Sergeant Doc, who was my bodyguard and interpreter, he was a martial arts expert also. He reaches up and he grabs this guy, coming right down the dike, and just grabs him. And before you know it, he's all tied up. And the Vietnamese want to take and interrogate him. Well, their method of interrogation usually didn't produce very much that was usable. So we were able to take this guy and we interrogated him differently. And we got a lot of information from him.
We interrogated him differently. You said you're using maybe euphemisms that are polite. Were they more aggressive than you were, and therefore it wasn't usable? or were they not aggressive enough?
I mean, they would hook people up to field telephones. They were brutal. But the other side was brutal against them too. I mean, I can understand it. I didn't agree with it.
You saw that stuff happen in front of you. You're like, that doesn't work. What did you do that worked?
I'd actually really rather not say. It was not physical at all. And the information we got was a lot better. Like, we had two Viet Cong main force battalions that operated in the province. One was down by the South China Sea, and one was just above us and up in the Vinh Long province. And that's area right there is where the VC movement actually got started back in the late 50s. But this guy was, I know I'm going to get my number wrong, but I think he was from the 501st VC Main Force Battalion. And he was a political operative, but the tax collector was his thing. And what we found on him were the tax books and how the land was going to be, ownership was going to be redistributed after Tet. That was immensely valuable. Now, the province chief, Lieutenant Key, didn't want to believe it because he said, no, there's no way somebody from the 501st is operating this far north in our province. Well, we found out during Tet that they were. So that's one thing. And there was a guy who came over, a high-ranking political officer, Sam. He was in the Chu Hoi program. And the Chu Hoi program was a program that if Viet Cong or even North Vietnamese came over to our side, they were given amnesty. This guy came over and wanted into the Chu Hoi program because the head political officer in the province, and the VC provinces were a little bit different than ours, so they overlap. But the head VC guy had been having an affair with his wife, and he tried to kill him, and he missed. So he was gone. So he came over to us, and then over a period of about a month or 6 weeks, we were able to confirm this story through other agents we had. And he became very valuable to us. In fact, he knew where two American POWs were in our province that had been captured in the early 60s. I was there 67, 68. I think they were captured in 64 and had been paraded around a lot. And we actually mounted an operation, and it blew up. I mean, we did it with 101st that had a unit that went after POWs. Of course, you had SOG, but they tended to operate more in the northern part and over by the Cambodian border. So we had that unit ourselves. And as we were in the helicopters, and on the assault, just a huge firefight blew up with the blocking force. And we never figured out if something leaked out, which it probably did, or if this guy who had been the Chu Hoi was just trying to lure a bunch of Americans in.
Obviously, the Tet Offensive is, something that I've read about. And I mean, how significant was that to you and your role in it? Was that the most significant thing? Or what were some roles, if you could talk about that?
There were a couple most significant things. I mean, going after those POWs at the time was really significant. Because one thing the Vietnamese never understood is that if an American were in trouble, the whole advisory team would just unload and go help them out. Because they didn't value life that much. Like, why would you risk lives? Those kinds of things, when we thought we were actually going to do something, were significant. Tet is a whole different thing. We had a lot of intelligence ahead of time that this was going to happen, but nobody believed it, particularly the Vietnamese. And so when Tet occurred, MACV canceled the ceasefire, I think about 24 hours ahead of time. And we all went on 100% alert and nothing happened. So the next night we were on 40%. And I was fortunate enough that I wasn't part of that. And so about 3:20 in the morning, all hell breaks loose. And I'm a really heavy sleeper. So I didn't initially wake up. Somebody actually shook me. And I look up and hear these tracers, coming across our building and through the window and all that kind of stuff. And fortunately, I had not taken my boots or my trousers off. And of course, you had your battle rig right there. It was just like mass confusion. The VC attacked. They're very, very clever. So they attacked the province chief's house They attacked the hospital, they attacked the schools, and they attacked the pagodas. We had in our province ethnically about one-third Cambodian. The province has some of the best pagodas outside of Angkor Wat in Cambodia. And so, I mean, we were just really getting overrun. They didn't attack the MacV house, but they were trying to. And they didn't attack the TOC, which was across from MacV, but they were trying to. They just really couldn't get that far. So one of the biggest attacks was on the southern edge of the town. Fortunately for us, on each branch of the Mekong, on each side of the province was the Navy LST, and they had each of them had 2 Seawolf gunships, PBRs, and a SEAL team. And so the rules of engagement were that those Seawolves were not supposed to be doing missions for us, but anytime there was an American in contact, they would come. And so over the radio, you'd hear, I can't remember the guy's call sign, but Seawolf so-and-so, we just scrambled, we're on our way. And so here come 2 helicopter gunships, and they had worked with us a lot before, and they disrupted an attack on the southern side of the city. That morning, I was going to the hospital to meet the recon unit, the Vietnamese recon unit, because the doctors didn't want to come out. We had 4 military doctors on our advisory team, and they were in there working on people. Finally, they came out, but the VC got into the hospital. They got into the schools, and I had been with Howard, the SEAL, and Ken that morning, but we were going different ways. So Howard and Ken ended up going to the province, the governor's house. Ken was seriously wounded. He was wounded in the stomach and in the butt. And Dr. Leonard, who was our head surgeon, an Air Force surgeon, and one of the nurses saved Ken's life by operating on him right there. And Howard was going into, I think it was the province chief's place. Bud was already there. And as Howard is going in, Howard was very fond of the M79 and hand grenades. And Howard, he said he went flying through the courtyard. And just as he's doing that, some VC pops up with an SKS, and they both turn to face each other. I mean, Howard's telling this story very matter-of-factly. And they both shoot. And Howard's got an M79. So he said, I felt this. It was like a 200-pound bumblebee stung me in the butt. And it went all the way through both cheeks. He said, but I killed the guy. He ended up with a Silver Star that day. At one point, Bud Hightower, the CIA guy, radioed over and said that through their channels, they had got a U.S. rifle company was on the way. And our morale just skyrocketed because it really looked extremely bad. We were burning documents. And about an hour later, they hadn't come. And Bud said, well, they've been diverted. And that was the end of that. But by that time, one of the Vietnamese battalions had been operating in the south, and they didn't take their families with them because Tet was coming up. And so they fought their way back, literally. They had like 3 major firefights on the way, and they arrived along with the Seawolves. That went a long way to saving us that day.
What was the highlight of it, the peak for you, or what were some other things that you'd like to talk about in the last few minutes of the Vietnam experience?
The really good day was when we saw that we weren't going to perish during Tet, when the tide changed. And when Tet occurred that day, I mean, I remember it like it was today. I mean, the sky was deep blue. The weather was just unbelievably perfect. The bad part of it is we couldn't get any support. I mean, if it wouldn't have been for the Seawolves, the Seawolves really went a long way to saving us, and they also went a long way to saving Vinh Long, the province above us. The really bad day was when a good friend of mine, he was ambushed. He was one of the district senior advisors, and he and his unit were ambushed, and the VC executed him with his .45 and executed almost everybody there. And Howard and I were going through that on Monday, and something I had put out of my mind, but the VC basically blew their skulls off and took their brains out. And we found them. We couldn't get to them soon enough. It was one of these things where a lot of the advisors emptied out to go to their aid, and it didn't work. And that's absolutely the worst day of my life.
So, I mean, obviously, super traumatic moments. You just tell something that's just an awful story. A lot of what we do is you talk about how we transitioned and what we did in life. And of course, you've had a very, very long and successful career, and you've been a mentor to us. What was it like coming post-Vietnam? What did you do? And what are some highlights of it?
One of the things that I really got a lot of gratification from was working on the Phoenix program. We thought we were making a difference. And that, along with Showalter's, don't be inflating the statistics here, because I don't play the game. So, I mean, I had what I consider to be a really good experience, and I would do it all over again. So I ended up getting out when I left Vietnam. And I always wished that I would have stayed in. But I remember getting to San Francisco, and there were a group of us. Actually, we'd come over from Oakland, Travis Air Force Base, and then to San Francisco. And at the airport, I ended up getting eggs and tomatoes thrown on me. And there were 3 or 4 of us there. We didn't know each other. And one of the airlines guys came out. I can't remember if it was United or American, but it was one of them. And he said, "Come on back in." He said, "We're used to this." So they took our uniforms and they had them cleaned. And, we were there for a couple of hours. Right after I got back, I'd been accepted at the MBA program at Michigan State, and I find myself in the MBA program. I don't think I have PTSD, but one of the funny things that happened was it was one of these really warm September days in Michigan, and it was windy, but the air conditioning had been turned off in the buildings. And so the doors and windows were open, and this big classroom door goes slamming shut, and I go rolling right underneath a desk there. And I am there like this, and then I'm going like this, where's my 45? I always slept with my 45, always. There's silence in the room, That was strange. When I got out of the MBA, and I told you my grades weren't very good. I got almost a 4 point, and I hardly studied. It's like that thing about we think your son should mature. Well, it took me more than a year, but it actually worked. So I ended up going to work for a bank in the investment department. And then after that, I ended up going, because that wasn't really going anyplace. And it was back in the days where banks were heavily regulated. I ended up joining a consulting firm named Touche Ross. Touche Ross, well, it was a consulting and accounting and tax firm, but I was on the consulting side, and they were bought by Deloitte. And I met some really good friends there. And I stayed at Touche for, I think, until 1978. And then I went to Freddie Mac, where I became an officer back when they didn't have problems. And we were trying to go public, and we got shot down in the Congress by Merrill Lynch and Fannie Mae because they said we'd have an unusual advantage in the marketplace. And so from there, I went to Salomon Brothers, and a guy named Lou Ranieri, who became the vice chairman, was our head banker at Freddie Mac, and he really wanted to change the way mortgages were done in the United States. And the technical thing is he wanted to disintermediate the S&Ls. I worked up there, and the transition was beginning to come together. I worked there as a consultant, but I might as well have been an employee because I was there all the time. So I met a guy named Jay Conley, and Jay is the guy I told you I think flew for SOG in Vietnam, and Jay was a partner there. And Jay was involved in putting together the ticker tape parade, the movie and book Dear America, Letters from Vietnam, and the memorial to Vietnam. And so there were 6 of those guys, and there were 5 other of us. We like to call Jay in the front line and the 5 of us in the second line. So I worked on that. And we put together the biggest ticker tape parade since MacArthur. And Mayor Koch was heavily involved in that. His chief of staff was a guy from Vietnam who was heavily decorated. And I mean, that was one of the most fantastic things around. we raised at that time, this was in like 86, I think, we raised $1 million for veterans to help them get jobs. And Donald Trump matched that with $1 million. And I asked Jay if he were ever in the military, and Jay says, never. But to Trump's credit, he wrote that check. That was very successful. It was an effort over a couple of years. Like I say, it was the largest ticker tape parade since MacArthur. And then from there, I did some work for Perot Systems, worked for one of the founders of Perot Systems, and worked for Ross Perot. Interesting character, to say the least. And then I had pretty much been on my own. So I also worked for a company named James Martin and ended up traveling to Hong Kong and Manila quite a bit. But then the general counsel I worked with at James Martin introduced me to Dan and Mike. The transition for me was very difficult because I was bored. I mean, I couldn't get excited after having done, what we did. It was difficult. And until I met those guys like Jay up at Salomon Brothers and got back in, I was really, really bored, even though I kept having, more responsibility. One of the interesting things I found out when I was doing consulting early on is we had a contract with the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And what we found out was that the counselors, for the most part, had been former drug addicts. And it's because they couldn't leave the culture. Instead of being on the bad side, they would go to the good side. So when it comes to transition, I mean, everybody's different. It's really important to figure out who you're transitioning to and what those people are like. Because, I find, Dan to be really great. I mean, first of all, Showalter was a VMI graduate. So there's a connection there. And so for me, being at Salomon with those guys, being with Dan and those guys, is what the real difference is. It's that culture. And that's what it was for me. I mean, everybody could be different. But I don't like backstabbers. I mean, one of the things I like about your culture statement is it's like 4 or 5 things. The first one is no jerks. I've done a lot of work with CEOs and people at that level, and they're always trying to put together a culture statement that's like 7 pages long. You don't need that. I mean, it's hard to find.
I want to hear your stories, and I think that you need to share them. And I would love to, read what you're writing. I'm excited for it. But if we could just be the start of you sharing your incredible stories, that'd be awesome. Do you have anything else? We'll do a part 2 later. Do you have anything else final for today?
I really appreciate doing this. I've never done this before. I used to say that, I still say it. You remember the good things and you tend to forget the other things. And everybody deals with it differently. And I've got a lot of experience because of my partner, Jeannie, and she works an awful lot with traumatically injured soldiers, sailors, Marines. And so I feel a real affinity to the tribe, I guess is the way to say it.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay. Thanks much.
That's it for this episode. If you want to check out more from the podcast, head to zeroeyes.com/nobel, where you can see show notes, read more about our guests, and suggest guests or topics of your own. Until next time, stay in the fight. Don't ring the bell.